Mohini said, translates to heaven touched poet, heaven blessed poet. And Bendre himself was actually very firm in this belief that there was a poetic Shakti, a poetic power that was inspiring him and giving him this poetry. And he named this poetic Shakti Ambikātanayadatta in honor of his mother Ambika. And he often spoke of Ambikātanayadatta in the third person. And there are several interesting stories, but I don't know that we have time for that, maybe later on. He wrote prolifically, Bendre. He wrote 1,427 poems in Kannada over about 60 years. But perhaps his greatest achievement was his use of Dharwad Kannada. Now, Dharwad Kannada is the form of Kannada spoken in the Dharwad region of Karnataka, which is in North Karnataka. And technically speaking, it's an Upabhasha, which is a sub-language, a register, a vulgate. And what Bendre did was to use such a vulgate to create what you might call high poetry, serious literary poetry. And this is what Wordsworth had wanted to do when he outlined his poetics, and that Yeats too wanted to do, but neither of them could manage. But Bendre managed to do this, write in Dharwad Kannada and create a high poetry. I believe that a singular and unprecedented achievement in all of world literature. That, together with the variety of his output, his preternatural feeling for the very pulse of the Kannada language, and the incredible nada or the euphony of his poetry, together, I believe, make him one of the greatest poets to have lived. Greatest lyric poets, at least, to have ever lived. And the Kannada people should be proud and also consider themselves fortunate for having produced both a poet and a poetic Shakti who wrote in their language, Kannada.
So Ambikātanayadatta.
Yes?
Sorry, I was just saying Ambikātanayadatta, as you were explaining it, is according to him like a third person or like a different. So it's not a pseudonym, but it's a.
Not at all, exactly.
He believes that it's something that writes within him. It's something external to
yes.
him. Writes.
Yes, exactly. One story I can tell is apparently he used to go to functions to be felicitated, and he'd go up on stage and they'd garland him with flowers, as is the case in India. And he'd accept the flower garland, but before he put it on himself, he'd say, now Bendre would like to offer his felicitations to the great poet Ambikātanayadatta, and then he'd put the garland over himself, So he really believed in this separate poetic power, and he spoke of it in the third person, believed that it was within him and was the reason or was dictating the poetry that he was simply acting as a scribe to, and that is very piquant, isn't it? I mean, you don't really hear about all of that happening too much. It's almost mystical, but he believed in it firmly. As far as my own relationship with Bendre poetry goes, it began with my not learning Kannada in school, really. I grew up speaking both English and Kannada at home, and I went to an English medium central government school, which didn't teach Kannada, but taught Hindi and Sanskrit. And so I learned to read Kannada on my own much later, when I was about 25. And as a consequence, I was introduced to Bendre through song rather than as text. This happened when I was in college, and several years before I had begun to learn Kannada. I hadn't even heard of Bendre at the time, I believe. It was only later on that I realized that I listened to a Bendre poem, but I loved its rhythm, and two lines in particular had stood out to me, and I think they're worth reciting. Tretayuga Ramanna Dvaparada Krishnanna Kaliyugada Kalkina Kandana is how it went in the song, and they stayed with me, and I've translated this whole poem also. So my next encounter with Bendre happened when I began to teach myself Kannada, and that too was kind of serendipitous. A father's friend, a family friend, gave me a book that was all about Bendre, that talked about his poetry, his charismatic personality, his gift to the gab and all of that. And generally fascinated, I bought a lot of other books about him and began to read about him, and also listened to some more poems of his as songs. I first tried translating a poem by him in 2015. Now, 2015 was kind of a breakthrough year for me in terms of my own English poetry. I wrote quite prolifically, and I think it was the joy that that gave me that spilled over and made me want to translate also. And so I took up a poem. It was a rather casual attempt. I took up a poem called Nanu that I'd listened to him recite, and I thought it would be interesting to see how I could use the rhythm of his recitation to inform my translation. And it went off okay. But I'd say that I really and properly embraced translating Bendre after my success, as it were, with the translation of Gangavatarana. Now, Gangavatarana, usually known as Ilidubatai, is one of Bendre's most famous, most popular, and most euphonic and iconic poems. And I had read a Kannada explanation, terrific vyakhyana, as it were, an explication of the poem by somebody I know as Sunat Kaka, and that had given me the courage, as it were, to begin a translation simply out of curiosity almost. And I began it, and I was helped by this explication, and I found a rhythm, and I continued. And then there's this one portion, Moini, this one portion of the poem that is especially complex and is very different from the rest of the poem. And I came to that, and it was daunting, and it was what you might call untranslatable also at first blush. But I don't know how, but in some magical manner, extremely fluid translation of that part. It was almost like the Ganga herself was flowing, as it were, because that's what the Gangavatarana is, right? And it was that feat that constituted crossing the Rubicon, as it were. I mean, there was no looking back after that. And so once that happened, I continued to translate Bendre's poetry. I've translated about 60 of his poems since then. And the experience has been wonderful, immensely satisfying, enriching. It's allowed me to play with the English language in all sorts of ways, which I might not have otherwise done if I hadn't begun to translate his poetry. It's also informed my own poetry, the one I write in English. And all in all, it's just been an extremely satisfying experience. But I should say that in light of how I got to Bendre, it seems to me that it was more destiny than choice that I began to translate him. I mean, it wasn't until 25 that I even learned to read the language that he wrote in. So yeah, if this is what destiny is, then I'm thankful to destiny.
No, that's an incredible story. Thanks so much, Madhav, for sharing it. It's amazing to me that you only taught yourself the language at 25, didn't learn it in school, and have now, so deeply sort of jumped into the translation process, and are doing, and are so prolific with it. I know that you've been translating so much and so regularly on your blog. So, congratulations on your work.
Thank you.
I know that we don't have that much time because I do want to give the audience time for questions. But of course, I want to talk in detail about the session title today is The Sound of Poetry. And sound, you said, is a very crucial aspect of Bendre's poetry. Sound or nada is something that drives or sort of, it is the crux of why we enjoy Bendre's poetry so much, whether it's in song or whether it's just the rhythms of the poetry. So how do you keep those intact in your translation? And maybe you could take us through some translations, to explain how you do this, or it would be great to just find out more about the process.
Sure. You're completely right when you say that Bendre's poetry abounds in nada, Moini. I most often translate nada as euphony because it's not just a sound, but a pleasant sound. And so euphony seems to work best. And like you said, it's also the reason for this session's title. I'd like to begin by reciting two separate stanzas. Atanitana yatanada yataneya yata kirugottodu nindhanga nanina nudi nungi tanina taneta tanagi tananana bandhanga. ಆವು ಈವಿನ ನಾವು ನೀವಿಗೆ ಆನು ತಾನಾದ ತನನನ ನಾನು ನೀನಿನ ಈ ನೀ ನಾನಿಗೆ ಬೇನೆ ಏನೋ ಜಾಣಿನ. I deliberately chose these excerpts because, according to Bendre himself, they're examples of untranslatable poetry. About the first excerpt, the first stanza, here's what he said, and I quote, "To translate it would require us to pluck out the Kannada language's heart and graft it onto another language." As for the second stanza, it's from a poetry collection called Nakutanti, 4 strings. It's a collection that won him the Jnanapeetha award. And the first thing he said in a radio interview when asked to describe the collection was that it was a collection of untranslatable poetry. But I imagine that despite not understanding this, if you don't know Kannada, and even if you do, because it's not just untranslatable, sometimes it's indecipherable too, you must have realized or been able to sense the nada at the heart of Bendre's, at the heart of these 2 excerpts. And Bendre himself at heart was a Nada Lola, a romancer of sound, you know. Nada to him was what lyric poetry was all about. It was about producing nada, and so he employed every lyric technique there was, and once he invented to generate this nada. Alliteration, assonance, internal rhymes, rhythms, musicality, metrical variety, all of these are employed towards the generation of this nada. And I believe it's the presence of this nada that is the reason most people believe Bendre untranslatable. And to a large extent, it's true that he is untranslatable. But because he wrote so many poems, like I said, 1427, I believe there are poems of his that can be translated. And I've looked to do that over these last 5 years. And like Mohini said, I'd like to offer some examples of the kind of work I've done. This much is true, that transferring Bendre's poetry into another language necessarily involves transferring this nada. And so these examples I'm going to offer you, and that Mohini will put up as text, right, Mohini?
Should I put them up now?
Yeah, you can put them up now, and I'll talk about them, not in detail perhaps, but in a little way. And so, can everybody see that? I believe they can, right? And so, I've color coded what there is, and I believe you can see that. And it's to show you the equivalence that I've looked to create in the English. And let me begin. The first 2 excerpts are from the poem Gangavatarana, which I talked about. ಕಂಚು ಮಿಂಚಾಗಿ ತೆರಳಿ ಬಾ, ನೀರು ನೀರಾಗಿ ಉರುಳಿ ಬಾ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಹೊಡೆ ಮರಳಿ ಹೊರಳಿ ಬಾ. Come as the lightning flash, come as the rolling water splash, come as the thunder smash. I've also given small descriptions about what I've looked to do, end rhymes maintained, addition of an internal rhyme. So I hope you're looking at that, and maybe I can talk about it in our Q&A. And now the second one is a portion from that very complicated part I referred to earlier. And it's the first half of it. And let me read it out, and then let me read the translation out. I hope you can see the color-coded words there, colored words. Suraswapna vidda pratibimba bidda udbuddha shuddha neere ಎಚ್ಚೆತ್ತು ಎದ್ದ ಆಕಾಶದುದ್ದ ಧರೆಗಿಳಿಯಲಿದ್ದ ಧೀರೆ ಸಿರಿವಾರಿಜಾತವರ ಪಾರಿಜಾತ ತಾರಾ ಕುಸುಮದಿಂದೆ. So you must have noticed the end rhymes, the internal rhymes, the use of both Sanskritized Kannada and non-Sanskritized Kannada. And I've looked to maintain what I can as far as rhyme and rhythm goes. And let me read it out. Beloved, into whose waters fell reflections from the God's dream well that made your pool of consciousness swell, Gange with new opened eyes, Gange who now does span the skies, ready to descend upon Bharati's thighs from the starry flowers of the holy Parijata's bowers that fed upon your showers. So yeah, this constituted a breakthrough as far as my work with Bendre's poetry goes. And now I'd like to talk about some other things. Now, one of, I think, the main challenges a translator faces, somebody translating from, say, an Indian language that is phonetic in nature into a language like English that is non-phonetic, is what to do with sound that is onomatopic. And here's an example that comes from a poem that is written in the Dharwad Bhasha, that's sort of folksy, as it were. Kanninyaga bannada nota taka taka kunidadatitta. So that becomes, within your eyes the colored gaze did dance takadimi dance. So I've almost kept it, I made taka taka takadimi, but otherwise the onomatopoeia in the translation is the onomatopoeia employed in the original, and it works over here, I believe. Now let's look at another one. Kuniyale maganani annodande tada tannana tanana tandana. And that becomes dance, you rascal, dance, he says. Tannana, tannana, tandana, he plays. And over here too, if you read the whole poem, you'll see that this works. An almost wholesale transfer of the very same onomatopoeia in Kannada to English. Tannana, tannana, tandana. But this isn't always feasible, right? It has to be done sometimes because English doesn't possess such onomatopoeia. But here are a couple of examples where I've looked to work with what is uncustomary to English, but that serve to highlight this nada. So, nigi nigi mugilu, nigi nigi hagalu, kendava karuadu. Hot hot sky, hot hot day, pours forth an embrace heat. So you see how this nigi nigi has become a hot hot, which is two words, and it's in some ways very Indian in its nature. We say things like simply, which is a virukti, which is a repetition, and it comes from us speaking like that in our language. Chal chal ke, hog hogi. All of these viruktis, these repetitions are a very natural part of a phonetic language, which Indian languages are. And this is what I've tried to do. The hot hot is not an invention, but an unusual use of English in order to find something equivalent to the original Kannada. And now here's another one. Chumu chumu nasukinali hoogalu araluvevu. Now chumu chumu is really just sound. It's onomatopoeia. Nasuku is the dawn. So now chumu chumu, it could have been kulu kulu, it could have been anything, but it's referring to the shimmer of the dawn. And shimmer itself is onomatopic in English, but how do you keep the even more onomatopic sound of the Kannada? And I've done that by saying, in the shimmer or the shimmering dawn, the flowers begin to show. So shimmer turns up twice, but not like hot hot, but in this fashion, shimmer or the shimmering dawn. So it's repeated twice, but in a slightly different fashion. And now I'm going to talk about two standalone transcreations or translations, because they're from poems that can't fully be translated into English. So they're just stanzas from these poems. This stanza is particularly famous, and perhaps it can be discussed in the Q&A because there's a lot of interesting stuff here. Matu matu mathisi bandana dadanavanita higgaviri higgalittu tannatane prita arthavilla swarthavilla baryabhavagita. The churning of the word brought forth a euphony, a It felt a joy, it spread a joy, and its own love, it was happy. It did not mean, it did not want, it was just lyric poetry. So here I've looked to create an English equivalent that can be sung to the same rhythm as I sang the original Kannada. And I'd like to end with another standalone transcreation that I learned because I liked the rhythm so much and I began to sing it in a sort of swinging tune. And it's an example of Bendre rejoicing in the nada that has come to him and that has been brought most likely by Ambikātanayadatta, So let me sing it. ಗಾಳಿ ಗಡಲಿನಲ್ಲಿ ತೇಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತಲಿಹವು ನಾದ ಬಂಡವಾಳದಂತೆ ತುಂಬಿ ವಿವಿಧ ಭಾವ ಮೋದ ಯಾವ ಗೆಳೆಯ ಗುರುವಿನಿಂದ ಬಂದಿತೋ ಪ್ರಸಾದ ಎನ್ನುವೆ ಹೈ ಹಸಾದ Euphony come sailing through the airy sea like treasure chests filled to the brim with every joy and glee which meant a friend was it who sent these wonder gifts to me. Yippee, yippee. So yeah, those are the examples I thought I'd provide.
That was absolutely brilliant, Madhav. Thank you so much. I think
Thank
everyone's been enjoying, just seeing it visually. Just how you reproduce the sounds and also hearing you sing it out, and you've set it to tune as well, your own translations, which is the most fantastic part of this. So this was
Thank you.
I wish we could keep listening to that.
Thank you, Mohini.
Some Unni Krishnan here has said that Madhav stating that it is destiny that made him translate Bendre. It seems to me that Bendre's Ambikātanayadatta spilled into Madhav like a mind-to-mind migration, which is
okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, that's really a compliment. And thank you.
I'm conscious of the time, and we have talked about translations quite a bit. I do want to,
yes.
We'll see if we have time, maybe come back to some of the questions we had. But I do want to know about where you see your work going from here. You've been working so hard on all of these translations. What is your vision of your future engagement with translation and poetry? You are, you've been doing this for the last 5 years. You must see it going somewhere. So where would you like to take this work? How would you like to take it forward, and what are you looking forward to in terms of your engagement?
Yeah, these are interesting questions, Mohini, and thank you for asking them. I'm reminded of what another Kannada to English translator told me when I reached out and sent the link to my work. She replied saying something to the effect that I'm odd that it was Bendre you chose to translate, And I suppose my point is that Bendre's poetry is kind of the Kannada to English translator's Mount Everest. And not aware of it, it was the very first mountain I began to climb without any preparation almost. And if I was to continue this metaphor, then I'd say that it's impossible to summit the mountain perhaps, but I think I've done a fair job of climbing it and I'm proud of how far I've reached. As to where I see it going, I'd like to continue to translate Bendre's poetry, but of course, like I said, I'd like to publish a book so that I can dedicate it to my parents. And more than that, I'd like people like yourself, people who are interested in poetry, people who are interested in translation, people who would like to translate themselves, people who are literary translators and accomplished translators already. I'd like them to engage with my work. I mean, a lot of people have come to my website and there are hits that testify to how many people have come and numbers and whatnot. But I've had very few people engage with these translations and I've done so many of them. And it's nice to hear a compliment and hear them say, oh, it's wonderful. But if I could have a discussion about it, say, or something that they think is particularly interesting that we could discuss, I'd really like for that to happen. And for that to happen, if a book needs to be published, then I'd love for that to happen. I have about 60 translations now, and if it could be published, there have been a few translations of Bendre, but none of them so far have really paid that much attention to the nada, and as a consequence, they don't contain the rasa that they should, perhaps, the pith, the essence that they should, to make them poetry that stand shoulder to shoulder almost with Bendre's own. And so if there's anybody in the audience who's in the publishing field and is interested, I'd be happy to hear from you, of course. But yeah, I see myself maybe publishing a book, continuing to translate Bendre, of course, but also having something come of it in the form of engagement, because that's what a writer, a translator wants. Engagement with their work. I think you'd know that, some sort of engagement, a back and forth, a serious engagement. So if, to those of you watching, do go to the website Moini mentioned and read the translations there and let me know what you think. We can discuss it, of course. I'm open to all of that. I'd like to meet you too if it's possible. So yeah, that's about how I answer that question, Moini.
Great. That was a brilliant pitch. I hope people are listening. And yeah, I think it would be great to see this other publication someday. So I'm really looking forward to that. There are some questions coming in. Madhav, would you like to sort of wrap up this conversation with any final thoughts, or should we just come back to those questions if we have time later? Because there are quite a few questions on Zoom.
I know there are. And do you think there's time for a little song that we discussed? Perhaps?
Yeah, we could do the song and then we can move on to the questions.
Yeah, sure. So
do you need to project the visuals, or do you not?
Yeah, what do you think I should do, Moini? There are two. I mentioned possibilities. Should I stick to just Jogi, or should I give an example of the others? Of the others.
You could do one now, and if we have time later, we can come back to it.
Okay, so then I want to end with Jogi. So if I do Jogi now, I don't want to end with something else. So what do you think?
That's fine. We can do Jogi now. We'll come back to the next.
Okay, sure. So now, yeah, you can project that perhaps. But now Jogi is this poem that was called the poem of the 20th century in Kannada literature. And it's a poem that I never expected to translate. It's considered one of Bendre's greatest poems with good reason. It's a poem that is written in the Dharwad form of Kannada, in Dharwad Bhasha, but reaches, Olympian heights, Himalayan heights, really, and is full of this nada that Bendre is known for. I wish I could sing it, all 12 stanzas, but I don't have the time for that. Another thing that makes this poem interesting is that Jogi is written in a meter, a Kannada meter, that Bendre devised in order to translate Kalidasa's Meghaduta into Kannada. So Kalidasa's Meghaduta is written in the Mandākranta meter, a meter that was popularized by Meghaduta, and Bendre translated that using a meter of his own invention. And then he would go on to write more than 50 poems, I believe, in that meter itself. And so would so many other poets, because it just seemed to fit the rhythm of Kannada so snugly, that it's a wonder that it hadn't been thought of for about 1,000 years, almost, if you will. And so this is an example, as I was telling Moini before, of a transfer of rhythm and rhyme and sound, not just across two languages, but across three languages. Bendre, being the Nada Lola he was, looked to keep the Sanskrit rhythm in Kannada. And then I, having listened to the Kannada song, looked to keep that rhythm in my English transcreation. So having said this, let me show you how the Mandākranta meter sounds. Two lines from the opening two lines of the Meghaduta. Kaschit kanta viraha guruna svadikarat pramattaha shapena sangamita mahima varsha bhogyena bhartuhu. Now if Jogi was sung this way, it would sound Uratudiya amuru bhatte ಬಟ್ಟೆ ಮುಗಿದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಳ್ಳವೆಲ್ಲಿ ಹಳ್ಳಾಡಗಿ ಹರಿದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಡುಗುದನ ತೊಂಡು ಮೇಯುವಲ್ಲಿ. But the tune I first heard Jogi in was not this, but this one. ಊರ ತುದಿಯ ಆ ಮೂರು ಬಟ್ಟೆ ಮುಗಿದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಳ್ಳವೆಲ್ಲಿ ಹಳ್ಳಾಡಗಿ ಹರಿದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಡುಗುದನ ತೊಂಡು ಮೇಯುವಲ್ಲಿ. And so my transcreation, English transcreation, which I never even meant to do, I just learned this poem and I kept singing it and singing it and singing it. I must have sung it 1,000 times, 5 times a day. My father learnt it by heart because I was singing it so often. And anyway, I'm going to sing the poem in this tune I just sang it in. I'm going to sing the first 3 stanzas and then I'm going to show you how it sounds in English, because it was to this tune that I set the English transcreation. Let me begin. ಊರ ತುದಿಯ ಆ ಮೂರು ಬಟ್ಟೆ ಮುಗಿದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಳ್ಳವೆಲ್ಲಿ ಹಳ್ಳಾಡಗಿ ಹರಿದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಡುಗುದನ ತೊಂಡು ಮೇಯುವಲ್ಲಿ ದಿಕ್ಕು ತಪ್ಪತರ ತಪ್ಪಿ ಹೊಕ್ಕರ ಕಕಾವಿಕ್ಕಿಯಾಗಿ ഇരുಳು ಅಂತನ ಹಗಲಾಗೂಗತವ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಜೋಡಗೂಗಿ ಅದನ್ನ ದಾಟಿ ಆ ಮಸಣವಾಟಿ ಎಡಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಅದರ ಆಚಿ ಕಾಮ ತನ್ನ ಹಚ್ಚಂಗಿ ಹಾಸಿಡಾಂಗಲ್ಲಿ ನೀರ ಪಾಚಿ ಹೊಚ್ಚಿ ಹೊಂಡವನು ಮೆಚ್ಚ ಮಾಡತವ ಕಂಡ ಕಣ್ಣುಗಳಿಗೆ ಪಾಚಿ ಸರಿಸಿದಾಗ ಕಪ್ಪು ನೀರು ಕರಿತಾವ ಒಳಗ ಬಳಿಗೆ ಅದರ ಮುಂದ ಗವಿಗುಡ್ಡ ಅಡ್ಡ ಬರ್ತದ ನಮ್ಮ ಬಲಕ ಅತ್ತತ್ತ ಹರುಹಿ ಹತ್ತೊತ್ತಿ ಬಂದ ಕಾಳಮ್ಮಗಿರುವ ಹೊಲಕ ಆ ಹೊಲದ ನಟ್ಟ ನಡುವಿರುವ ಹುಣಿಸಿ ಮರ ಏರಿ ನೋಡಿದಾಗ ಹತ್ತ ಗಿಡದ ಗುಂಪೊಂದು ಕಾಣತದ ಸಣ್ಣ ಏರಿ ಮ್ಯಾಗ. Is how the first 3 stanzas sound in Kannada. And when I first translated the English, I mostly read it out. But I came to see that it could actually be sung in almost the same manner. And so that's what I'm going to try to show you now. Yeah. Now you can see it on the screen, I hope all of you. At the edge of town where the 3 fork ends and where the slope begins, where the running stream ducks under and row cattle go grazing, the way is lost, and if once lost you enter unknowing. A stricken pair of owls appear hooting through the mid-morning. Past that place and past the graves and beyond to the left lies such a lush of thickened moss it seems like Kama's vest been spread luxuriously across the surface of the pond. The moss removed, black waters call into the dark beyond. Past all of this come caves and hills rising to the right, spreading here and spreading there, encroaching Kalama's sight. And when we climb the tamarind at the center of this site, we see 10 bushes in a clump upon a little height. So yeah, that was the recitation.
I think everyone is bowled over. That was really, really brilliant. Thank you so much, Madhav.
Thank you, Mohin.
So you basically recreated that meter in some forms in English, haven't you? And firstly, it was amazing to know about Bendre creating that meter and devising that meter to translate Kalidasa into Kannada. And then you've clearly, replicated it in some form in English, which, given the difference in, the phonetic sort of quality of the languages, and, it's quite a task. It's a huge challenge. So,
yeah, I really don't know how I did this, Mohini, and I say this completely truthfully. I had no idea of translating this when I first listened to the song. What happened was, I listened to this song, and in this Kannada Bhavagita tradition, which began in the 1930s, where they took poems and set them to music so that they'd become popular. Part of this tradition, of course, is popularizing poetry, and it's done a great job, but also because some of these poems are so long, they don't sing them wholly. They sing a part of it. So the song I listened to, the song version of this poem I listened to was just 6 stanzas long. And when I first listened to it, I had no idea that it was that it had been labeled the poem of the 20th century in Kannada literature and whatnot. But I loved it really. I really liked the tune and the music, and so there were just six stanzas, and I found the poem in a poetry collection, and I decided that I'd learn the other six stanzas myself because I wasn't going to get anybody else to sing them to me, so I'd have to sing them to myself basically. And so I learned the other six stanzas too, and so I had all 12 stanzas, and then as I recited them, I learned them by heart, and then I just sang them all the time because they were just so nice to sing. And like I said, I believe I must have sung them for about 7 or 8 months, every day, 5 times at home, on the way to work, this, that, and whatnot. And when I finally decided to translate it, I remember this one day when I just thought I'd translate a couple of lines because I'd been I'd been engaged with the poem for so long that I thought, okay, let me see how this might sound, and I had this rhythm to go to, and so I jotted down a couple of lines, and so I remember that the first draft contained non-rhymed verses, as it were, and then after that I worked on it, and I found that I could get some rhyme in there too, and then there were all sorts of compound words that I made up as I went on, and really, this is a poem that is magnificent. Like I said, I'd like to mention this one thing. Rudyard Kipling once said that there are five, and just five, in all the millions of lines written in English poetry, there are just five that you can call, about which you can say, these are the magic, this is the poetry, And as far as I'm concerned, Jogi alone contains four such lines. The part I sang didn't contain any of them, but as far as I'm concerned, there are four such lines, and I've written quite extensively about this. And so if you go to my website and read what I've written there, you'll be able to see what I mean about how I got to translating it and whatnot. But yeah, that's about it, Moini.
Brilliant. I'm really glad that we could hear this. And, the meter in this, the rhyme and rhythm in this, even the hot, I forgot to mention when you translated that, I've never seen it, used like that, where, you do see some translations as hot with a hyphen or with a space, but the way you've used it, it just gives it a very different flavor. So, you've clearly done something where you've really thought about how to recreate the essence of his poetry. And of course, it's something that means so much in Kannada literature and is obviously very difficult to translate. And, the question of untranslatability is a very long one and it can be debated constantly. But, it was really fascinating to know about how you've done this. I'm going to invite Sango to ask his question, which is in the chat. Yeah, Sango, can I request you to put your audio on and ask the question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Sango. Yeah. Hello, nice to hear.
Thank you so much for this wonderful experience of listening to Kannada poetry for the first time. I have never read Kannada poetry or listened to Kannada poetry, so for me it was a wonderful experience. One of the questions that I was wondering was, do you see a connection between Nada and Rasa? If so, what is the level of connection that you feel that is there between these two concepts?
Sure. Thanks, Sango. I'm glad I was able to introduce you to Kannada poetry, and perhaps the best Kannada poetry there is, modern at least. As far as your question goes, it's a very interesting question. I think I noticed it in the chat. So Nada and Rasa, they're not really very different things if you think about it, So Rasa is basically, it's translated in several ways. It can be translated as the essence, the pith, the quintessence, the juice also, for instance, there's a Kannada dish we call saru or rasa, which basically is a liquid dish, as it were, with some pulses in it. And so rasa is sort of this juice, this essence of something. And now Nada, as far as Bendre was concerned, was what his poetry was about, or what he wanted his poetry to be about. And so there are these 9 rasas as far as Sanskrit poetics is concerned, and they've been talked about ever since Bharata's Natya Shastra in about 2000 years ago. But the idea of rasa is, it is something that moves you in some fashion or the other. These 9 rasas include Hasya rasa, I believe, and then Bhibatsa rasa, which is, and then Shanta rasa perhaps. But nada itself can evoke a certain reaction, I believe. And that's what it's done in me with Bendre's poetry, and it seems to have done with a lot of you. If I'm sounding too loud, sorry.
Fine now. It's better now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so nada doesn't, nada itself can be a certain rasa, I believe. I mean, for instance, if the rasa is meant to give you some sort of pleasure, it's supposed to give you some sort of, a feeling of happiness, as it were. Kavyam Anandaya is an old Sanskrit saying. Poetry is for joy. I mean, that's the reason poetry should be written. And if nada can do that, then it itself is a rasa in some ways, a nada rasa, if you will. And I think that that's about all I can say concisely, as it were. I mean, both these are big topics that have been discussed over hundreds of years. What nada is, what rasa is, but this is how I see it. So is that all right, Shango? Have I sort of answered your question?
Yes, I think that was a wonderful response, and thank
Great.
you, Shango, for that wonderful question as well.
Yeah,
There's
thank
a
you.
question on Facebook by Sunita Pansal, and she asks, are there any other similar nada poetry available in any other Indian languages?
I'm curious myself. One of the reasons I say Bendre is Bendre, I mean, there's nobody like him, or like Ambikātanayadatta, is because there was, in general, across India, after the Bengal Renaissance in the 1860s and Tagore's rise, who everybody looked up to, including Bendre. He was a model for Bendre, not his poetry necessarily, but he was Guru Deva to everybody, right? And so Tagore set his own poems to songs and whatnot. But as far as nada goes, once English literature's modernist movement began to influence Indian Bhasha literature in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s mainly, it became mostly prose poetry, modern poetry dealing with urban, what you'd call, disarray and all of that sort of stuff. It was looking to capture a certain dissonance that was being, that was happening because of increasing urbanity. And so something like this nada became secondary in poetry. It became sort of an intellectual exercise. And all of us grew up, I believe, enjoying poetry for its nada. I mean, children's rhymes are really all about nada. And then we get further and further away from it, as it were. Mohini's translation of Sate's Frog and a Nightingale, I mean, that too is an attempt to keep the nada of the original and almost go back to, I mean, and when you listen to it, you sort of like it simply because there's so much nada in it. And to the person who asked the question, I'm not sure. In Kannada itself, contemporary poetry possesses no nada lola, no romancer of sound like Bendre. There have been several people who've written good poetry, but nobody at that level. And I'm curious myself if other languages in India, if poets in India actually used, like Bendre did, a register of the language. This Jogi is written in the Dharwad register, which is why, I think it's an astonishing achievement. Imagine, and this is one thing I tried to do. I tried to keep the vocabulary of the translations, of my translations of Bendre contemporary. I didn't use romantic tropes of inversion, things like, and then my heart with pleasure fills, which is an inversion, and all of that. But I looked to keep it contemporary because he was an uber contemporary poet, as it were. He was writing in the spoken language. It's something that Wordsworth had wanted to do, Yeats had wanted to do, but they never quite managed to. They had to write in literary English, as it were. And here Bendre was writing poetry that very quickly, Mohini became and to the questioner became the closest. Actually, now that I come to think of it, Bob Dylan's oeuvre, for which he won the Nobel Prize, is perhaps the closest to something like Bendre, writing using common speech sometimes and setting it to music. He sets it to music. Maybe there's not a musicality on the page, but he sets it to music and eventually creates a nada by doing so. Some of the poets I read and I like are Yeats. He was a great influence when I first found him. Then there's a collection of poems by Tagore called Child Poems. The Crescent Moon, they're a collection of child poems, and I think they're perhaps the most exquisite poetry I've read, some of the most exquisite poetry. I don't care too much, or I don't know very much about his Gitanjali and all of his other songs and everything, but those child poems in the Crescent Moon that he himself translated from the Bengali are just out of this world. So they're sort of my Trimurti, as it were. As far as I'm concerned, Bendre, Yeats, and Tagore are a Trimurti in my opinion. But then I also like some modern poetry. There's one poet called Karen Volkman, or Folkman, however you say her name. I found some of her sonnets full of this sound. And then I do like another one is Gerard Manley Hopkins. He too tried to use sounds and in a different way than it had been used before, something called a sprung rhythm. And they say that and of course, another one is Dylan Thomas. And I think Mohini liked this because, he was Welsh, right? And Mohini is a Welsh enthusiast. And Manley Hopkins also is supposed to have got this idea of a sprung rhythm because he lived in Wales. He wasn't Welsh, but he lived in Wales. And so they say about Wales that there's a musicality to the language. I can't speak for it because I really don't know, but I think Mohini can. And this sort of musical sense of a language, and then its use in poetry has always appealed to me. So poets should do that. Dickinson, Emily Dickinson is another favorite, but Yeats really, I'd say, is an abiding favorite. So yeah.
Thank you. You can go and check out Giridhar's comments on Facebook later on as well. There's a lot of engagement there. And yes, it's true that Welsh poetry is also very, very, sound is a very crucial part of Welsh poetry. There's a particular meter, very, very ancient meter in Welsh called Cymhanedd, which almost translates to harmony. So it also, like you were telling us about assonance within the lines, alliterations, internal rhymes. There's a lot of that goes on in Welsh poetry as well. So yeah, you're right. It is something that's very, very important.
Yeah, that's great. I think interesting that some of English poetry's greatest poets have had roots in other places of the UK and brought sounds from there. Yeats was Irish and Dylan Thomas was Welsh. And accurately speaking, Bendre had Marathi roots, and he grew up in, I suppose, a bilingual household, and they migrated from Maharashtra, and so he grew up speaking both Kannada and Marathi, and he even wrote poetry in Marathi, but it just doesn't stand as tall as his poetry in Kannada. And here's an interesting thing, when I read, there's a very good Rasika of Bendre from whom I've learnt a lot, Shankar Mokashi Punekar. And when distinguishing Bendre's poetry and talking about his Marathi and Kannada poetry, he says, Bendre wrote Kannada poetry and it was all right, but it doesn't match up to his, he wrote Marathi poetry and it was all right, but it doesn't match up to his Kannada poetry. And that's because while Bendre's mother tongue was Kannada, Ambikātanayadatta's mother tongue, when Bendre's mother tongue was Marathi, Ambikātanayadatta's mother tongue was Kannada, And he says, those of you who can understand what I mean will understand, and those of you who don't, won't. So he was another one who believed in this Shakti, this power that was Ambikātanayadatta, that Bendre believed in passionately, and he believed he was ascribed for.
That's very, very fascinating. It's been amazing to just discover Bendre through you, and it's really been incredible to hear your translations. I think I can speak for everyone who's listening into the session today. So I think I think, a lot of comments coming in about how this has been one of the best sessions. So thank you so much,
everybody,
for engaging. And we are coming to the end of the session, and we do have to close. Any final thoughts, Madhav, that you'd like to close the session with, and then I'll sort of wrap up.
I don't know. I'm thankful, Mohini, for this engagement that your platform has given people, for the chance that this has given people to engage with Bendre's poetry. And thank you very much for giving me this platform. All I can say is, I like to do this. This is something I do. I began it perhaps as a hobby, but now I do it with some passion, of course. And I like to sing his poems. I like to sort of spread the word about Bendre, because I think, like Mohini said in that bio, it helps the Kannada language's cause, as it were. I've also worked with other poets. You can find that in a Kannada to English.com. That's the other website I maintain, where I do non-Bendre poetry and other stuff. And you should go there, and especially something called Punya Koti. I think some of you will like it. I've tried to translate Punya Koti, which is the favorite among Kannadigas. Perhaps every Kannadiga or every Kannada speaker has listened to that poem sometime or the other. But as far as final thoughts go,
is there another short song that we could end this on?
Short song.
Maybe the other one that you had planned to sing.
Yeah, okay. So one stanza of that, or do we have time for all?
We could do one stanza, because it's 8 now.
Okay,
I don't want to keep it for too long, but we can do one stanza.
Yeah, sure. So then, do you want to pull it up, or shall I just sing it? And
you can just, I'll pull it up actually. Why not?
Okay, that the tum 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 tum, that one. Yeah. So this is a poem that I remember. This is a poem about which Sunat Kaka, who was perhaps the first reader and first Rasika, and I'd like to thank him for being that, and whose explication I used to translate Gangavatarana. About this, he said that he called it Atyuttama. He said there's nothing in it that I would change, and that really made me extremely happy to hear. And so this one is really Nadamaya, full of nada. And I'm going to sing the first stanza of it, and then you can see and then I'm going to recite it too. Tum 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 tumbi banditta tangi tumbi bandittu ಬೆಳಕಿಗಿಂತ ಬೆಳ್ಳಗೈತ ಗಾಳಿಗಿಂತ ತೆಳ್ಳಗೈತ ಜಡಿಯಿಂದಿಳಿದ ಗಂಗಿ ಹಂಗ ಚಂಗನೆ ನೆಗೆದಿತ್ತ ಮೈಯೊಳಗಿರುವ ಮೂಲಿಗೂ ಮೂಡಿ ಬಂದಿತ್ತ ಅಡಿಮುಡಿಗೂಡಿ ನಡುವಂತೆಲ್ಲ ಮುಳುಗಿಸಿ ಬಿಟ್ಟಿತ್ತ ತಂಗಿ ತುಂಬಿ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು ತುಂ 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 ತುಂಬಿ ಬಂದಿತ್ತ ತಂಗಿ ತುಂಬಿ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು. And now for the translation. It was more bright than light and slighter too than air. It sprang like Gange did from the locks of Shiva's hair. It rose in every nook and corner of the body's frame. It joined head and toe and center and flooded them each the same. Sister fulfilled had it come, a fulfilled had it come. Sister fulfilled it had come. So yeah, this tum 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 translates to 3 different things at the end of each of these 3 stanzas. So over here it becomes a fulfilled had it come. In the second stanza it becomes a buzz, the buzzing came the bee. And the last stanza it turns into the end had come at last, sister, the end had come at last. But so because it has 3 meanings, it becomes 3 separate things at the end of each stanza. And it was that really, I don't quite know how I decided to do it, but again, it's a slightly different use of English, the idea of something, right? It's slightly old, but it works in this case. To just say full wouldn't work, but a full works out in the same way that tum also works, right? And so that this transcreation, whatever you want to call it, really gave me a lot of satisfaction and brought me a lot of joy, as it were.
Oh, this was brilliant. It brought all of us a lot of joy. It was so catchy. Thanks so much, Madhav. This was really
thank you, Mohini.
No, thank you, and thank you everyone for being so engaged. And I really do want to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart for helping me create this initiative and being a part of this initiative from April. There's no way that we would have gone on if it wasn't for so much support from all of you and so much interest from all of you in translation. Who knew there was this large community in the world who was so fascinated by languages and translation? So I'm so glad that we've all found each other and are able to have these discussions every week, every month. So I hope to keep going in 2021. But for now, have a great end of the year. I hope all of you are safe and have been through, I hope we've all been through the worst part of the year and it'll only get better from here. So take care, everyone, and have a brilliant holiday season. I hope all of you get some rest, and thank you so much again. And we really look forward to seeing you at Mother Tongue Twisters next year in 2021, hopefully with some new exciting sessions in store. Do please follow us, keep regularly engaging. It's really